Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Carbon, founder and principal of Art Plus Public Unlimited, an art consultancy that brings people closer to contemporary art in their everyday lives. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be virtually touring Black Drones in the Hive on view at Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery, an exhibition walkthrough experience featuring artist Deanna Bowen in conversation with curator Crystal Mowry. This is the very first in a series of live virtual exhibition tours hosted by Art Plus Public Unlimited, featuring current exhibitions we wish we could see in person and which we would like to ensure are seen by many. The exhibitions featured in this series invite contemplation on the role of art in the development of collective histories and/or the role of collective histories in the ongoing trajectory of what is recognized as art. Woven into this is thinking about the continually negotiated points of intersection between the individual and the group, personal experience and collective narrative, the private and the public. I'm excited to bring our audience a series of tours that delves into this in a format which really underscores the role artists play in making sense of the world around us, the role curators play in bringing this work to an audience, and the rapport and working relationships developed between artist and curator through the process of exhibition development and implementation. By organizing virtual walkthroughs framed by conversation between artist and curator, we hope this series gives audience members a sense of the exhibition space, an understanding of curatorial considerations, dialogues between curators and artists, insights behind key works, and for those who have been able to join us in person today or virtually, very excited about offering the opportunity for live Q&A with Deanna and Crystal. I'm joined today by Art Plus Public Senior Associate Sagan McIsaac, who's been absolutely instrumental in planning and coordinating today's events. And now I'd like to formally introduce my guest today, the people you've actually tuned in to hear from, artist Deanna Bowen, in conversation with curator Crystal Mowry. Deanna Bowen is a descendant of two Alabama and Kentucky-born Black Prairie pioneer families from Amber Valley and Campsie, Alberta. Bowen's family history has been the central pivot of her autoethnographic interdisciplinary works since the early 1990s. She makes use of a repertoire of artistic gestures in order to define the Black body and trace its presence and movement in place and time. She is a recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the 2020 Governor's General Award, 2016 John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship, and the 2014 William H. Johnson Prize. Her writing, interviews, and artworks have been published in Canadian Art, the Capilano Review, the Black Prairie Archives, and Transition Magazine. Bowen is editor of the 2019 publication Other Places, Reflections on Media Arts in Canada. Bowen lives and works in Montreal, where she is an assistant professor of intersectional feminist and decolonial 2D to 4D image making, photography, and intermedia at Concordia University. And Deanna is on this year's shortlist for a Scotiabank Photography Award. Crystal Mowry is senior curator at the Kitchener Waterloo Art Gallery. During her time with KWAG, she has curated and coordinated over 100 exhibitions. Her solo projects with Ontario-based artists Maggie Grote and Ernest Detwaller have received Exhibition of the Year awards from the Ontario Association of Art Galleries, and in 2020, she was recipient of a Waterloo Region Arts Award. She has written curatorial and experimental text for various art-focused projects, including Still Move, Brendan Fernandez, a monograph on the performance and installation work of Brendan Fernandez, for which she also served as an editor. Deanna and Crystal, it is such a pleasure to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So how are we going to do this, Deanna? And I say that only because I always want to defer to you, right? Because this project is so of your head, but I feel like I've had a front seat for its evolution. So maybe what I'm going to do is start by handing things over to you.
Oh, wow.
Wow. I guess what we can start by saying is we have a deck of slides and installation images of the exhibition, which unfolds over three core spaces at KWAG. And for folks who are joining us this afternoon, you're going to see floor plans such as this one. And we're going to kind of walk through the exhibition with the floor plan, stop and chat about work specifically, and how those images came into the world and how they can speak to the or participate in a larger conversation, which is like this sprawling project. So we're starting in the foyer of the gallery, where you can see the "You Are Here."
Honestly, you
Note.
cracked me up.
All right. So these are the two first works you see, and I don't know, Deanna, do you want to chat about them?
Yeah. I was hoping they're gonna settle. So we're in the front of the gallery space. These are two images that we've talked about before. Something that we kind of have centered around this idea of the death trap, death loop, so to speak. What's possible for the Black body as it relates to representation, or at least white people's representations of the Black body, and the cycle being something, represented or illustrated through this postcard of the death of Uncle Tom, 1901, that I've scanned and enlarged and printed, and this very tragic death of this Black figure, surrounded by, devoted and prayerful Black bodies around that, and the white savior at the center with the Black maiden next to him. And just thinking about that patterning and how that plays out in contemporary society and representation, and the death trap of that image itself. And then also next to it is the other part of that cycle, which is an enlargement of Thomas Nast's Emancipation of the Slaves from 1863. And it is this pictorial of a Black family at the center, and the depictions of the full cycle of slavery, the Civil War, the harsh realities of Black slaves in this context, and just seeing that this is what's possible. This is the psychology of the white author, so to speak, as it relates to Black people. But it is by no means a kind of an accurate reflection of Black life as I understand it, or any other Black person understood it. But it's the beginning. It's the thing that sets up the tone for the rest of the show. And I think it's also the opening of a door to kind of prepare people for, the gravity and the scope of what's to come. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think at this point, when folks are coming into the gallery, they haven't seen the exhibition Didactic yet. So they haven't necessarily seen the kind of framework that we're imagining for this project, but they are hopefully being introduced to this vision of a kind of Black martyrdom proposed by white authors. And this is kind of the intro to seeing or understanding that most of the images that are that they'll encounter, visitors will encounter as they move through the gallery, are authored by white folks, that they are may be visions of, or interpretations of, or references to Black life in our region, Southwestern Ontario, and kind of broader Canada and into the US, but they're not always, let's see, how do I want to say this? They are honest, but they're not necessarily telling the whole truth. Let's just say that. So as you move into the gallery, you then encounter the didactic signage. And one other thing I will say briefly about didactics throughout the gallery, I mean, for many of us who go to museums and gallery shows, we are accustomed to seeing explanations positioned aside works to help encourage or kind of coax us into kind of understanding what we're seeing. There is a lot to read in this exhibition, in part because documents form a substantial part of the content. So there is this kind of realization that there could be a kind of a fatigue in reading throughout the exhibition, and we want to be able to create these kind of layers of interpretation throughout the exhibition. So, and perhaps this is a kind of subversive strategy, but the the result, I hope, of not including extensive didactics beside each cluster or constellation of images is that you have to defer to other sources to understand what's going on in the exhibition. So you have to like listen to Deanna talk, you have to listen to the two of us talk, or be on a tour to kind of be with people to kind of get a start at seeing, understanding what you're seeing. Deanna, do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of the directive or the sort of thematic direction that was guiding this project? Because that crops up in the didactic, but I think you can offer a more eloquent introduction to that.
Yeah. You mean as far as the whole organization of the show? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in my mind, kind of, it's a riff off of kind of a conceptual principle that I work with, that my artwork is a form of publishing, of writing, in fact. And so with the logic that, you know, art, visual art, sculpture, photography, video, performance all has a language of its own. It is a language in and of its own, right? And so I like to tell stories with art, right? And then if we follow that logic, then this exhibition arguably is a book. It's divided in chapters. Within this segment right here is a chapter that spends its time kind of taking up issues around eugenics, Kaiser Wilhelm I relations, the deep German history, deep old German history of the region. This pedestal is also kind of part of another discussion that'll kind of unfold when you turn the corner. And that is, you know, the history of Kitchener, formerly known as Berlin. And again, that brings up a whole bunch of other stuff around British-German relationships and imperial regimes. I think all combined, what I'm trying to kind of do is unpack the various kind of histories that this particular spot in the institution, where the institution is, it is a region very rich in history, despite the kind of single. Now, I'm not from Kitchener, but my perception of like one of the major kind of thematic thrusts about what Kitchener is about is its German cultural history, and, you know, things like Oktoberfest and those kinds of rich but somewhat surface kind of engagements with German culture. It is obviously a very much older community, but that is only one part of the story. This site is also a region that is part of the Underground Railroad. Kitchener, Berlin, formerly Berlin, also is part of that. It's indigenous land, Six Nations Confederation. It is an agricultural site. It is a refuge for formerly enslaved. I mean, it's many, many things. And so the book does the work. Black Drones in the Hive, the book / exhibition, does the job of unpacking it all and presenting a more complex understanding of this site. Remind me Britt's last name, Crystal. I always forget. I feel like a horrible person.
Soster.
Okay. Britt was the rock star lead installer technician for this exhibition, and they produced this extraordinary replica of a life-size replica of a pedestal for now missing but famous bust of Kaiser Wilhelm I. And the bust sits in Victoria Park in Kitchener. And the reproduction of this pedestal comes along at a time, of course, when Confederate statues and that ilk are kind of being toppled, thrown into the water, that kind of stuff. And this is a very similar story, but it is also another story that is central to the foundations or the understanding of Kitchener as it is understood now. The pedestal used to hold this bust of Kaiser Wilhelm the first, but it also speaks to a deep and very real violent antagonism between British soldiers, British citizens, and the German community that had settled here during the First World War. And that, I think, is a critical kind of piece of the puzzle that will open up a much broader global discussion of this particular city and its history.
Mm-hmm. And that incident, that the toppling of the monument, so to speak, or the commemoration of Wilhelm I is tied into a kind of a larger series of riots in Kitchener at that time, anti-German, motivated by anti-German sentiments. I think 1916 is the year that the second riot or the second disappearance of the bust, and that's when it's gone for good. And that's also happening at the same time that the city is rethinking its name, and a referendum is held on the name of the city. And what do they choose instead of Berlin?
Kitchener.
They chose Kitchener. And for those folks who know a bit about their history will know that, you know, that's not a noble name. That's the name of someone whose legacy is wartime atrocities, which is, you know, concentration camps tied to the Boer War, and, you know, extreme violence. And, you know, I think, can't remember actually if the image of the ballad appears in our show. It did appear in your show in Berlin. I know that, but
I don't know that it does. I think the story about how, like, the whole story of how it plays out with the back end and everything is told in
a news clipping. There's a news clipping.
It's a newspaper clipping that tells the full story. And I thought that was a better way to get at the story, to kind of tell the full story in a very concise way, right? Versus the ballad, which I think is also very, it's out there. That's a readily kind of used image. And I wanted to kind of pull up something else that was a bit fuller. So yeah, the newspaper clipping, and the poll, the list of possible names, that being in Berlin during the Berlin Biennale, that made sense to me. It was a kind of shorthand that I thought would translate better in that context more so than, does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's for folks who are based in the region, or, you know, for me, I've worked in Kitchener for 15 years now. That story of the disappearance of the bust is our lore, right? Like, that's the story that the city keeps returning back to. And I don't know if it's motivated by a desire to reassure itself that it is capable of some kind of, I don't know, noteworthy civic action or what. I'm not quite sure why, but it is a story that kind of I don't know, it's like every 10 years or so, there's another kind of refresh on the read on that event. But I mean, it's also kind of, I think, speaks to our conflicted relationship with commemoration in this part of Ontario, and perhaps other parts of Canada as well too. I mean, yes, for sure, in other parts of Canada. You know, how do we choose who gets to be commemorated publicly, and, you know, how long do we choose to honor those legacies in public space? I mean, this is also happening at not far off the date that Harriet Tubman dies, which is wild to think about these two histories kind of overlapping.
Sit right next to each other.
They sit right next to each other, yeah.
And that's but you can say that about a lot of time markers, critical markers in time that we all kind of know. And that's really where the strength of this, or this is where the concept of all of this comes from, right? 2010, I did I recorded an oral history of my family's migration. And the only way I could actually achieve to tell the story, to literally kind of provide the project of recording it, was a mind dump in a way, because I had so much data in my brain, right? But trying to make a sense out of all of that information and the intersections of all these things, and then having to figure out how to make that relevant to somebody who's not in my family, and still make it kind of legible. That's when the introduction of kind of parallel events in time really started to happen, was in that project. So being able to map, by example, a birth of a great uncle, and aligning that with Vincent van Gogh painting his first, the painting The Starry Night, right? So like the fact that these kind of things could happen at the same time has been kind of playing out in the work for quite a while. And I think that this is probably the most successful iteration of it, of illustrating, the various clocks that are happening in anyone's life, in our time even, right? The fact that we even having this conversation speaks to the fact that we're engaging with history on the daily. So, and again, the way that things butt up, because, and I guess where I, just to kind of bring that home, just to consider that in many ways, this project speaks to a time frame that is like 100 or more years ago, but it has so much political resonance to this moment in time right now, and how everything that we're talking about is kind of very much in play in contemporary society. So yeah, the multiple clocks in multiple ways, I guess, is at the core of it all. Sorry, got happy there.
No, it's funny. I haven't heard you. I mean, we haven't talked about the timescales that way before. And I know it's always been in the background, because occasionally we'd have a conversation and we'd say, oh yeah, that was the same year. Remember, like, remember there was, for the longest time on my desk, there was the image of the act to abolish slavery. And I would look at the date on that, and then something else clicked. Oh yeah, that's the date that the cornerstone was first laid at the Washington Capitol, or that's also the date that John Simcoe arrives in Toronto and starts kind of scouting out the landscape a bit. So it's amazing to think about. Well, it's nice for us to acknowledge it here. Those time scales overlap, right? So, you probably remember, like a year ago, we were going through all sorts of images together. We were meant to be sharing space, physical space, to do that kind of work. And the pandemic foiled our plans. But we persisted in kind of imagining some of these images and how they would come together. And I can remember so clearly, when we first started talking about eugenics and the traces of eugenics in southwestern Ontario.
Yeah.
And so the group of images, the constellation of images that you can see here, folks, is the Eugenics Chapter. And there are references to Wilhelm in there and to Queen Victoria. There's that central image that is a kind of rounded white rectangle with very fine type on it, is a slide that was presented at the Second International Eugenics Congress in New York, I believe. It's from the University of Guelph's collection. But is one of many artifacts that speak to the kind of support for eugenics theory in southwestern Ontario, and other things in there too. Deanna, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, because it's also, there are other elements in here as well that I think, what is it? Anthropometry, and the classification of bodies, study of brains. But this image at the top is a diagram, a scientific, quote unquote, diagram of the brain of an African bushwoman. Next to it is the cover of, ironically enough, a publication called the Concordia. And I was moving to Montreal to start my job at Concordia when I found this document. It's like, oh, wow, that's what Concordia means. Oh, anyhow, but Concordia, this is a global trade publication between African and Asian countries. And one of the headlines was something about the brain size and making art. I thought that was quite funny in a dark way. So I had those in there as well. But also in this cluster is an editorial cartoon on the cover of Puck magazine, which says eugenics makes the world go round. White Western male with a Cupid next to him as he kicks the globe around. And then also, it's a really interesting couple of headshots that test the Bertillon system, which is a category or a strategy of characterizing the bodies of criminals, which of course then gets kind of translated into contemporary context where it's misused, by example, the New York State Police Department and all of their classification of Black bodies. But in this instance, this is an image that works to foil that system and actually illustrate the error of the process very early on. It's an image called the two
Will Wests.
Yeah. Two Black men, totally different people living in different places in the world, but they by characteristic of the Bertillon system, they are identical. And I believe the case was that one of the Will Wests was charged and convicted for the other Will West crimes. They are genetically not related, but they look exactly alike as per that system. And I brought it forward for, of course, the way that also clearly kind of marks the beginning of, the classification of the Black body as inherently criminal. So I was caught up in that. And then finally at the top, there is reproductions of poetry by Confederation poets E. Pauline Johnson and Duncan Campbell Scott. And it's, that is a perfect example of people not recognizing how these things come together in time. That E. Pauline Johnson, the daughter of Sir William Johnson and Molly Brant, I think I have that right. I hope I have that right. But she, at the very least, E. Pauline Johnson is of that clan. And I'm sorry to the poetry people in the world that I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. But it's a curious kind of connection that she would have to Duncan Campbell Scott, superintendent of Indian Affairs, responsible for much of the atrocities that most Indigenous people are working through to the present day, residential schools and the criminalization of ceremony, amongst many other things. But the short of it all is that this kind of weird kind of connection between the superintendent of Indian Affairs through generations and the Brant and Johnson families, and how that is an unusual, it's a confusing configuration and a relationship in my mind. That they both as poets are published in the same book or volumes as quote unquote Confederation poets amongst a school of Canadian writers. I just find it to be a curious commingling that kind of plays out over the course of the exhibition in a number of other ways as well. But I thought it was important to name that. Duncan Campbell Scott, of course, is a contemporary of the Group of Seven painters and Vincent Massey and all of those characters. And that is a thread that flows from the Art Museum exhibition at U of T. So just kind of keeping the threads alive and looking at the ways that white nationalism starts to kind of filter into culture. Yeah.
So as you move, visitors who are walking through the exhibition space and then kind of turn a corner, and that's where we start to see like constellations almost fill our field of vision. They're occupy almost every wall in the gallery. So as you're walking around the corner, the first constellation you see is, or chapter, we're using different terms sometimes, is this Berlin one, this Berlin Kitchener constellation. And This is a work that incorporates elements of KWAG's own permanent collection, as well as a number of images that were gathered by Deanna. This constellation is now in KWAG's permanent collection, so I'm thrilled to be able to see, this portrait of Kitchener, Lord Kitchener, be tied to this narrative in our archives, in our files. There's also some moments in this constellation that are, for me as somebody who's worked in this community for so long, really, really potent reminders of, the absence of legacy for Black folks in our community, and, namely the story of Levi Carroll. And Levi Carroll was a formerly enslaved man who lived with his family in what was known as the first schoolhouse in the region. Was a laborer, a journeyman, not able to sustain his family and his living financially, and sought refuge at the Waterloo County House of Industry and Refuge, which is, maybe a kind of sanitized way of saying a poorhouse and a work camp, essentially, right? And this was a place where a number of folks who were, who had maybe compromised health or unstable financial situations, or who had been forgotten or overlooked by community, ended up living out the rest of their days, laboring for minimal to no means whatsoever, right? So we see like images of Levi Carroll with his family outside the house. We see directories for various professionals and laborers in town, a list of names among which is Levi's name. And you can see Levi's name nestled with, or not nestled, but positioned alongside all of these other names that are quite recognizable for folks who are in our community, because they're on street signs, they're on businesses, they're on buildings, they are remembered through kind of civic manifestations.
The schoolhouse is even
the schoolhouse is
even
too
commemorated,
For
but
sure.
not Levi Carroll.
Yeah, so there's hierarchies of commemoration that we become aware of as we're moving through the space. Of course, there's that hint of Kitchener, Lord Kitchener's relationship to the community through its naming. There are, like, the images from KWAG's collection include that electrified boot form, which was an industrial artifact from the Kaufman rubber factory, and we'll get into the Kaufmans, or one Kaufman in particular, in a bit. There's a correspondence between Homer Watson and Mackenzie King. And there's references to Alexander Graham Bell's homestead as well, whose history becomes, or whose history is tied to the eugenics movement through his support of eugenics theory and his role on the International Eugenics Council, and a whole bunch of other things in there, including an image of the retrieval of the bust of Wilhelm I from Victoria Lake.
The first one.
The first one, yeah.
The first one. That's
sure.
2000 or 1914.
1914.
Yeah.
Or 13. Something like that.
What else is in here? For me, I think the pieces that I am most interested. Well, I'm interested in all of them, but as it relates to, say, Kitchener, there are other elements in here that speak to who Kitchener is. There are the images of concentration camps and the scorched earth in Pretoria in South Africa that Lord Kitchener was responsible for. Just to kind of give you a point of reference, Lord Kitchener had actually established concentration camps before the Nazis established them in the Second World War. So that I think is a critical thing to bring forward. The German connection is kind of, we'll get to, well, actually, we should back up and actually make this connection actually is through Queen Victoria. And many people don't remember that Queen Victoria was in fact married to a German prince, and the family is culturally German, and her children are, connected to other royal families across the globe in Europe, Queen Victoria being imagined as the grandmother of Europe. And prior to 1911, prior to the First World War, there was a strong connection between Britain and Germany, these two countries, literally by blood. So this town, the fact that there is an anti-German sentiment that arises come the First World War is very much a reflection of the break, the family break between Kaiser Wilhelm II and King Edward, who is Queen Victoria's son. Is that true? Yeah, that's true. I have too much data. Anyhow, but I wanted to bring all that forward to say that, the things that are coming out of the soil are not just specific to the region. They are very much connected to the global empire or Britain's campaign of quote unquote annexation across the globe. It should also be said here that in the Berlin Biennale piece, I was trying to make connections between I lost it. Dang, it was going to be brilliant too. Anyhow, I was trying to make connections to the global empire and how all of those other kind of familial connections come into play. The same time that Kitchener was destroying South Africa, Wilhelm II was perpetrating the genocide of the Herero people in Namibia. So there's, these dueling empires that effectively are slaughtering Black bodies, not only in Europe, but also here in Canada. And what I wanted to, did I almost have it to bring it back? I almost had it, but I lost it again. Anyhow. So there's that going on, but there are other things that I think that are really important. Like there is a page out of the newspaper do you remember the name of the German newspaper that came out of?
Was it the Berliner?
Yeah, the Berliner.
Berliner, yeah.
And it's an editorial about Levi Carroll's birthday later in his life. And the very fact that he was written about, but for me, kind of how I think about documents anyhow, overall, about being obliged to kind of really rely on white people's documents to trace my own family and their characterizations of individuals and all that kind of stuff. But what I was thinking about in both of these instances is it's not a picture of a person, but it is a document that illustrates white people, the regional white people's awareness of a Black person. It's their knowledge of these Black people that are a race that I'm interested in. And the fact that this document really kind of serves as a kind of evidence of witnessing, I guess, is the way that I would look at it. And so that, you could say that for the whole show, really, but that particular newspaper clipping, it's written in Old German. I don't know what is the script?
It's like a Gothic font that, you would typically see with, or that appears actually quite often in our community on various business signage and what have you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an old German font, an old German language. It's reaching back to the Pennsylvania Dutch. But looking at that and that being kind of an evidence, even though Levi Carroll is long forgotten, there was a moment when people did acknowledge his presence. There's what else is there? There is a monument to Alexander Graham Bell, built by Walter Allward, I want to say, another G7 circle artist who was a sculptor. And then you've got evidence of the first families that went to the first schoolhouse, and the names that are listed, the elders that were the first to graduate from that school, and how those names are littered across the streets throughout the town. There's other things, like there is one piece, a shred of evidence from the 1916 riot that actually ended up with the bust of Wilhelm I being gone for good. But next to that is a handwritten list of all of the things that were destroyed by British soldiers when they Concordia Hall. And so that's a listing of the monetary value of the items that were destroyed, and these were submitted to the federal government. There was a formal complaint that was lodged about the whole thing. But anti-German sentiment was such that everybody was lowballed. Nobody got the amount of money that they deserved. And one illustration of how deep that animosity was is played out in a telegram from Lieutenant something Sutherland, who was the commander of the British troops in the Waterloo region, and it ends with this something along the lines of, admonishing the person that was putting in the claim for hiding behind their German. It was bad news. It was just a horrifically insulting letter that just really spoke to just how bare everybody's teeth was in that time frame. And all of this kind of hides under the namesake of this gentleman who, is also responsible for the colonization of Afghanistan, India, aspects of China, Sudan, everywhere, and this is the name that they take. So that's what I can say about those other things. I did not get into the boot, though.
Yeah, we'll get to the boot after this slide. I mean, there'll be a tie to the boot.
We'll get there.
But,
we'll get there.
These stories around like how we remember people is part of like a bigger conversation about how we remember the land, or how we acknowledge the land in this region. And the gallery is situated on the Haldeman Tract, which is land that was that's the traditional territory of the Ottawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Land was purchased from the Anishinaabe and given to the Haudenosaunee for their role in the American Revolutionary War and the loss of their lands elsewhere. But, you could walk all through the region, 5 years ago, let's say as recent as 5 years ago, and not see like any indication of that history, little to no acknowledgement of that anywhere. I mean, of course, now, I think there's an awareness and within our municipalities and our various governance structures that kind of omission is unacceptable, and speaks volumes basically. But through in the exhibition, you've gathered or convened a number of images that kind of hint at the kind of colonial entanglements that inform that omission as well.
Somebody's asking what the name of the constellation is.
This one?
Yeah, this one.
I think it's Haldeman.
Haldeman Tract, but it's also got the names of the, just trying to get to my slides on my end, sorry. It is Haldeman Tract, Brant, and the Johnsons. And it's speaking to the lineage of Joseph Brant. His father, grandfather, brother are illustrated here, as well as Superintendent William Johnson with the statue there, and his connection to the Johnsons, the Johnson clan, the Johnson family, which is depicted below the illustration of the Haldeman Tract, which is that blue map in the center. On the left of that is a depiction called British Warfare 18 30 something, 32 to 69, I think. If I've got the dates wrong, I apologize just for the data. But in short, what that is two British soldiers at the center, and they are basically kind of agitating a Black warrior on the one hand and an Indigenous warrior on the other. And it's a strategy, literally an annexation strategy, to agitate on either side and then get what they want whilst this is all happening. And so that kind of agitation and distraction and or pitting African and Indigenous peoples against each other is kind of depicted here. And I bring that forward for a number of reasons, but most centrally, it sets up the inclusion of another work that we'll get to later. But it also, I think, speaks to the realities of this landscape, right? This is land that was Indigenous. It was invaded by white settlers. There's an effort to enslave Indigenous peoples that fails. They bring in Black bodies from abroad and through the United States. And the kind of hostile it's not a melting pot, hostile concoction that brews out of the land here for a variety of reasons. And then also add to this, there's this two images. One is, this is a map that, do you remember the name of this? It's like the accurate portrayal of the war or something along that line. It's a map that's detailing the hostility of the landscape.
I've got it, just give me a second.
And then below that, while you're getting at that, is a depiction of, I was trying to find images of the Hessians, which are German mercenaries that the British brought in prior to the American Revolution, during the American Revolution. And those mercenaries were in fact the people that cleared the land, so to speak. You can imagine what I mean by that. And they are in fact the first German settlers to take up homesteads in this region, not the Dutch Pennsylvanian Germans that the town lore likes to tell the story about. So there's also the erasure of a lot of extreme violence by German military prior to the settlement of the town. So this is kind of what I wanted to bring forward. Did you have that
title? Yeah, the title of that image is A Correct Map of the Seat of War. Samuel L. Lewis and John Conrad, 1812.
Thank you. So also, which brings up the War of 1812. So, and then here, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so, in this area where you have these kind of three walls that are bordering a space that visitors move through, I mean, there are various references to the land where the gallery is situated, whether it's through theft, as we can see in the theft and violence, as kind of alluded to through that one constellation, the Haldeman constellation, and then the legacies of omission that we can see in that Berlin constellation. But on this on the wall on the right is a kind of a kitsch memento, I guess, from town. In Kitchener, they used to produce this annual yearbook of sorts that was kind of a collectible object called Busy Berlin. And it was kind of like a celebration of who's who in the community, largely people who were affluent or people of influence in the community, business folks. And there would be very kind of minor articles, not as many articles in the pages as there were images of real estate and advertising of sorts. But this is an object that Deanna was able to source, and in the pages we can see these homes of like the spread that we can see in our exhibition. And on the left is a kind of a grouping of large homes, and nearby KWAG, Queen Street used to be known as Manor Row, and there were all of these kind of majestic residences along that street that were raised to build the gallery and theater performing complex. And then on the right here, we can see this image of the Kaufman rubber factory, which is a kind of industrial, our version of industrial giant in the community. It was the child, the baby of Alvin R. Kaufman, produced rubber and boots. So Sorel boots come out of the Kaufman rubber factory. That building still stands in the community. I think it's been transformed into lofts now. But Kaufman has a kind of a dark history that, I think over time there's been a sanitization of that story, or kind of what its underlying meanings might be. And he's essentially known not only as our kind of local industrialist, but as the local champion of eugenics, offering sterilization services to his workforce. He was quite chummy with the heir to the Johnson & Johnson empire. And for folks who know a little bit about kind of histories of kind of medical experimentation and using racialized communities as test subjects, I'll know a little bit about how Johnson & Johnson intersect with that history. But Kaufman was known as a champion of birth control mainly, but sterilization and birth control are part of a larger eugenics story. And Deanna, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that.
Well, I think it's what do they call it? The Kaufman was part of a national campaign around birth control and population control. Right. Under there, if anybody recalls the term or the grouping, the Parent Bureau, and there are a number of documents at Guelph, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's a whole series of documents that are created around raising white families, and then the weeding out of the feeble-minded, the black drones, the excess labor forces, the dull, however which way people want to define it. I suppose you'd have to go back to that eugenics chart at the front of the exhibition to determine what you'd have to be to not be sterilized or ripe for sterilization. But I think it's important to kind of put population control within the context of labor, and to understand that this is happening. This birth control campaign, so to speak, the population control campaign, is happening as we shift from human labor to industrial labor, quite frankly. And I don't have a study or anything that I've read about that, except to say that you can just, again, in these kind of things that run parallel to each other in time, it has become, I've seen it a number of times over, where it's like there is a relationship between that, and you may not be able to kind of find it directly, but I'm willing to say, I would say socially you can ground these ideas, and I guess that makes its connection to the poorhouse down the way, and the erasure of Levi Carroll and the likes of, right, the black bodies that were classified in the poorhouse. What is it? The Waterloo House of Industry and Refuge.
Industry county. Yeah. It's a mouthful.
Waterloo County House of Industry
and Refuge. Mm-hmm.
Levi Carroll's buried behind there, as are a number of other black bodies that lived the last of their lives there. And if you know anything about the Tuskegee Airmen and the tests that were put upon those black bodies, or the indigenous, or the ongoing forced sterilization of indigenous peoples, these things are not benign. And I think I think it's important to read between the lines, between the connection of between this industrial site, the person that is at the held of it, and his preoccupation with controlling populations and invariably weeding out people, and the neighboring communities of Black and Indigenous peoples. I just think that there is a thing to be read there. And again, having the Guelph collection, the eugenics collection at Guelph, I mean, really, you can't not draw conclusions unless you really don't want to know the truth of it all, right? So I think that I'm thinking a lot about those things. I thought, do I want to? No, I'll leave it there. I think that that's enough for now. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also watching the time, so I know that we are.
You should
as
know
we
better.
are wont to do. We will.
As we are wont to do. Yes. Sorry, people. This is just how we talk to each other.
I know.
All the time
I know.
now.
It totally is.
Yeah.
But and I think just to kind of an anecdote about that book and about the Kaufman discussion, because I can remember, when we were texting each other about various Kaufman articles and kind of getting into the weeds in that history, also realizing at that point, like, as we're going through archives that are, we're doing it mostly remotely because of the pandemic. So going through university, local, regional libraries, national, US archives, provincial archives, all that. That's like, I think at that point we're really starting to recognize that in order to find evidence of kind of Black histories in this region in the archives, I think you could probably say the same, was having to adopt the language that you never would use in speech. So looking through our regional archives to find community newsletters or kind of staff newsletters for the Kaufman, and I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I should look at Dominion Tire because they're also in the region, another industrial giant. And that's when I started to find in their employee newsletters the most vile racist material, like jokes, basically, jokes in air quotes, about Black folks and not being able to do particular jobs or being lacking intelligence that would elevate them from anything other than being the butt of a joke. And it was horrifying. This was in like the kind of comic relief section of these employee newsletters. But unless you were trying out that language in the search criteria, you may not have found it.
You would never found it.
Right? So, when we say, okay, well, there's an absence in the archives, it's not necessarily true. It's just that, oftentimes we have to find ourselves going down these routes that are unsafe for us psychologically, emotionally, to find that evidence.
I think, just to add to that, there are early documents that speak to other Black settlers in the region, in the town of Berlin, that I find fascinating how they're not spoken about in the family lore. Black lawyers, Black barbers,
Barbers,
that,
yes.
set up shop, that had, a very real public presence. And the fact that they're erased is one thing, but the way that I found those two gentlemen in particular was by using, sorry to be quite blunt, but this is to illustrate the point, I started using the term darky to find Black bodies, because that was the term of the time. And so that helped me discover two Black bodies in the region that are the opposite narrative of the Levi Carroll story, right? And the fact that Levi Carroll, all said and done, is one of the few Black people that are readily available within the narrative is a whole other conversation in and of itself, because that brings us right to this image, which is the Amherstburg Jubilee Parade. And I adore this image. This comes out of the Ontario Archives, and an extraordinarily stealth back end move on their part. They are starting a campaign of releasing archival material that is copyright cleared and all of that stuff that they want people to have access to on Wikipedia. And so they have a Wikipedia page for the Ontario Archives, and they had at the very early days of the pandemic, coming into October, November, and just by being like super stressed about not being able to find or get any deeper than what I could buy online, and then finding this archive, and I was just deeply humbled. This is the Alvin McCurdy Fawns, the collection of images. And it's an extraordinary collection of images of Southern Ontario everyday life, and this Jubilee Parade is in there. And it's, again, when we talk about the British subject, the irony of the Union Jack being held up. The Union Jack, or what is the early flag? The ensign? Anyway, the early British flag being Victorian era British flag being flown in this parade of Black peoples with the full band, and this gentleman in the top hat and tux is just like, come on. And it's a gorgeous horse, and the pride of this and the very public display of community richness. It's not just one person, it's a whole town full of people, a whole community full of Black people that are showing, ironically enough, their allegiance to the Queen. And that they're erased, is just a tragic thing. But this is such a heartening thing, and it just makes me feel so thankful, and it keeps me going, because I would imagine to be able to find that the kind of pride that is being shown here in the context in which we are unpacking is extraordinary. No, the image was Charlene, no, the image was taken in Amherstburg.
Amherstburg, yeah. Yeah, and that Amherstburg image, I remember when we were trying to conceive of the installation of this exhibition, and for any artists out there will understand, like when you're working on a solo show, it's you're carrying a lot of that weight. And I think when you and I were working on this show, Deanna, there was a certain point where you were like, this is a lot of material, like you kind of figure out where to put some of it. We were having a lot of conversations about that, but there were some images that I thought, I'm not sure where this one needs to live, because I'm still trying to figure out its relationship to everything else. And because it was a standalone image, it made it that much more difficult, right? Like the constellations, you can kind of, they are a conversation on their own. They don't necessarily need to carry the weight of any other images. But this one, it was a tricky one. And then once it was in place, we saw its role perfectly. It was the intermission in the exhibition. And the reason why I say that it's kind of an intermission is because you can also hear throughout the exhibition the sound of Charles Ellison playing taps. And we're going to show an image of that shortly. But there is this kind of haunting soundtrack that pervades the whole main gallery exhibition space. And so something about Charles's performance and seeing this image together really kind of conjures something that is a combination of commemoration and rest and celebration, and perhaps other things for you as well.
Mm. We should go into the other room and I'll tell you what it speaks to.
Okay.
So the horn on the top is a 1916, I can't remember the make of the horn, but it was a horn that would it is a visual dupe. It's as close as I could find in a pandemic context of a vintage horn that would be similar to the horn that's in an image of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And the No. 2 Construction Battalion was the first Black battalion to ever serve in the First World War. It was a battalion that was not wanted. There were several protests against this all Black battalion, but the reality of the First World War was a bloodbath, and there was a need for the lesser classes of people to join the cause that weren't really lesser, but that's how they were understood. And so the horn itself was one of the first things I bought, thinking about how to kind of pick up the personal puzzle piece of this exhibition, which, I mean, there are other intimate parts into the show, but where the show began really in many ways was about trying to articulate my family connection, which is my great grandfather's brother's son. I don't know what that is in cousins. Like I think it's second cousin, twice removed, something like that, right? But he is a family member nonetheless, and he fought in the was part of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. I have his records. There are his attestation records are at the top, just over the other images, next to the image of the other all Black soldiers that were in the trench next to the bombs. And it's a way for me to kind of keep that personal connection to the research that I'm doing. I clearly have no kind of intimate relationship to Kitchener Berlin other than fabulous Crystal and the KWAG team, but I don't have family there. But this region is also a landscape, amongst other things. It's a landscape that has been deeply affected by numerous wars over its history. And so my second cousin, twice removed, Columbus Bowen, is in a constellation of other military images that speaks to the loss and bloodshed in this region, but also there's also that horn in the way that the army bands served as both a means to recruit, but also to uplift and probably provide a hell of a lot more of a closer means to sanity in this context. So you've got an image of the number 2 construction band at the bottom there. And then you have a letter from library archives about the horn player, the trumpet player, trying to keep the horn after the war because it was given to him by a friend during the war, and having to prove its authenticity and it's his ownership. It's aligned with images of white Canadian officers in France during the First World War, uplifting a cannon up a mountainside. Also, white military soldiers carrying their gear in the same way that Indigenous peoples would carry their belongings in the field. And then also, other things, Mohawk mothers insisting that the government release their sons from fighting the war, the white man's war. Images of the Black Battalion, the Black soldiers of the War of 1812, the white military troops that come out of Waterloo, Berlin, and other areas in this region. You have Indigenous war soldier as well, an Iroquois soldier who had enlisted, an illustration of that. But you also have other things that tie back to other exhibitions. You've got Vincent Massey and Lauren Harris in their riflery troop, and thinking about class and who actually served in the war and who was spared, and questions of duty, and how Lauren and Vincent Massey through class never actually fought, were never on the front line, but these folks from the country, these Black folks, these Indigenous folks, these everyday people are the ones that lost their lives fighting for empire, when in fact these two gentlemen who are so much more closely connected to empire and the monarchy, actually through Lauren Harris's mental breakdown, and I would imagine Massey's wealth, they got to sit it out. They didn't serve in the same way that these other people did. And so for me, it sets up a very clear illustration of who needs to be honored, and it's not the people that we have been kind of coached to praise for their service. The real people to honor are these folks, and my family's part of that. There's a couple of other nods. There's an image of all of the warlords, British warlords of empire, in their various roles, including Kitchener and a number of other individuals. And of course, there's an image of Vincent Massey and William Lyon Mackenzie King. In part because I want to continue to make the connection to the fact that Vincent Massey is intrinsically connected to Mackenzie King, and Mackenzie King is a gentleman amongst his other proclivities. He's from Berlin when it was Berlin, but he also was had an affection for Hitler and believed him to be a misunderstood character. And I think that matters when we start again talking about the ways in which Black and Indigenous bodies are cared for in Southern Ontario, because he was a gentleman that held office for quite some time, and his policies included eugenics and Planned Parenthood and all of these things that come to affect different classes of people.
Mm-hmm. There's also in that that kind of commemorative card with the Boer War heroes in air quotes is Baden Powell, who for former folks who participated in the Scout movement, the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts of Canada. he's one of the founding members, I guess the founding member of the Scout movement, also served in the Boer War.
I think we probably should. Yeah, that's good.
There's another image. And then there are a collection of small, like tangible commemorative objects in a case gathered here. Deanna, do you want to reflect on them?
Yeah, it's a replica badge of the number 2 construction battalion. Next to it is, I think that's a shoulder clip or pin from the 118th. And that is the White Regiment, I believe, that perpetrated the riot in Berlin. And then the 114th is the indigenous a troop that came out of Haldeman County. And so I wanted to kind of introduce those into the mix. And then next to that is this curious kind of pin that I thought that was kind of an odd representation in the way that this headdress is connected to the crown. And again, knowing that ceremony, particularly headdresses and the like, were banned up until the 1950s, right? And that kind of really conflicted, messed up kind of gloss over, so to speak. But I just wanted to kind of bring that into the mix. And then next to that are these figurines of Mohawk chiefs, including Brant, and a number of others. I have that around somewhere. I'll lose time if I try to find the names of the other soldiers, but suffice that there's this kind of miniaturization of great warriors to these kind of, I'm interested in that, especially when we're thinking about empire and the way that Britain upholds itself and the size of the monument for Wilhelm I and all of that stuff. I think it's an important thing to look at. The miniaturization is not, again, benign when thinking about history. And this is a lineage, literally, from Queen Victoria as she took the throne from left to right and into her mourning years in the second coin, to her son, and then to her son Edward, then to George, then to, I can't remember the one that abdicated, and then Queen Elizabeth, right? And that literally is a family line right there. And what I was thinking about with all of that is the reality that there is no Black body on any money that I can think of in the empire, save for Viola Desmond 2 years ago, but that's in Canada, not in Britain. And so what I was looking at is where the Black body resides in this time frame in currency, and it's on this token. This is an abolitionist token out of the UK. And it's inscribed, am I not a man and a brother? This was a token that was passed amongst other abolitionists to kind of illustrate kinship, so to speak. But it was really just about this idea of a questioning of when the Black body would be connected to, how it's connected to money or not, right? Whereas other people, other lineages are commemorated in very different ways and with a very different sense of value.
Mm-hmm. And money, in addition to money, value too, something of value, right? So even as a commemorative coin or something that's commemorative is thought to have value, but it's minimal, right? Yeah. Like it's only recognized if the recipient also recognizes that value too.
The value. Yeah. I mean, the real life irony of buying that coin off of online and it being in the hundreds of dollars, when knowing, that just the absurdity of it all is all. I guess I want to flag. I could probably think that through, but anyhow, leave it there. And then Charles,
and this is Charles. You can hear Charles performing through the gallery. So this is the room that's directly next to the room that held the various kind of military reference and in that constellation and the horns and such. And I don't know if Charles, this you recorded Charles in Montreal, right, at Oboro.
Yeah.
And you have a lovely story about getting to know Charles during that time.
Oh, he's such a sweetheart. I had foolishly moved to Montreal in a pandemic, in a global pandemic, and wonderfully landed at Oboro for a residency. And in my time there, I wanted to work with jazz musicians, partly because I knew I wanted to do the TAPS project, but then I don't know anybody in Montreal. And Oboro, the lovely Oboro folks reached out and they found Charles, and he was a friend of a friend, and we started recording in the studio. And he was just the most beautiful being that introduced me to the Black history in Montreal as he understood it, the Black cultural history. He had actually been in Montreal as a faculty member at Concordia since the 1980s, and so he just gifted me with an extraordinary amount of wisdom and generosity, and just beautiful. He's a beautiful, beautiful human being. And we recorded 2 different projects, one for this show, one for the Harlem Nocturne, which is the project that came out of the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver. And in having him record a piece for that, I explained to him that I was, part of the family that owned this jazz club in Vancouver called Nocturne. It was the only Black club in the city. And I just kind of on a whim, because he's a jazz head, I'm like, so would you know anything about it? He's like, oh yeah, I know all about it. And I just lost my mind, because for me, it was like, somebody who knew about my family's club back in the day is as close to a sign from my ancestors in my mind. It's such an obscure kind of knowledge of a place, to get to Montreal and this happenstance acquaintance, and the fact that he knows the club. But it just was the most beautiful thing. And I do truly believe that that's ancestors that at work right there. Truly.
And the significance of that particular composition is pretty, it's so finely tuned to the overall kind of, not necessarily just the mood of the exhibition, but also the various themes that converge in it. So, for folks who don't know, TAPS is a composition that is tied to military service. It's often played at military funerals. And it's also played at scout days or scout activities when one's labor is understood to be complete. And if you're a soldier, or you have any connection to kind of military life, you'll know that a soldier's service is only really understood to be complete when their life is over.
It's done. Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt, as you go through the exhibition, it becomes clear that there's so many people that need to be honored for their labor. And it's not just the military gesture, it's all of the elders of the region and the labor that they have done over time, just trying to exist, but they stuck it out. And it's an honoring of that as well.
Mm-hmm. So the final section of this main gallery portion of the exhibition is another area where I guess it's 4 walls that are covered, and you can see one of those 4 sections, I guess, of this section of the exhibition just on the right there. And I think, yeah, there we got a closer view of this group.
This is the Black Drones Constellation, and it's by the time we kind of got to the end of the exhibition, it kind of became clear what the Black Drone was. Can you tell the story of where the terminology comes from?
Yeah. So the title, I remember when we were chatting about the title of the exhibition, and I think at that point you knew that TAPS would have a space in the thinking of the exhibition, and you knew that TAPS would have a presence too, right? That we'd hear it. And we were trying to imagine a title that somehow acknowledged TAPS. And then we were going through the text of various kind of archival documents associated with the Waterloo House of County Waterloo House
Waterloo
County
County, no,
Waterloo
County
County
Industry.
House of Industry and Refuge. And the Deputy Reeve of the city of Kitchener is also oversaw the House of Industry and Refuge. And in his various assessments of folks who were kind of living and working on behalf of the House of Industry and Refuge, he makes a series of disparaging comments about a Black resident, and indicates that, I think it's William Robinson is the name of the resident, and he states that they're a perfect Black drone in the hive, and essentially insisting that, you know, all they are good for doing is performing labor, you know, not being autonomous, not necessarily being in a position of power to make their decisions about what is best for anyone, but just laboring on behalf of the parties who are instructing them to do so.
Yeah. So once it became clear in my mind, once it became clear what the Black drone was, or who the Black drones were in this community, it was the means for me to connect to my family, to my own family, right? It is, you know, again, in this kind of constant the pairing of times, we'll say, or the matching times. My family came to this country in this time frame. So, you know, 4 years prior, 5 years before the riot in Berlin, my family came to this country. Civil War, my great-great-grandmother is in this constellation. My grandfather's in this constellation. The Amber Valley Newburgh Church, and all of my family is up in this constellation. It's also, you know, it's the everyday laborers, it's the people, it's the laborers on the farm, it's images of formerly enslaved Black peoples migrating across the nation. It's images of, again, the cycle of the slave, again, and that death loop, in a series of images that are just quite depressing. Images of former slaves that lived in Southern Ontario are in this constellation, as are the Marble School in Amherstburg. My great-great-grandfather's home in Nicodemus, Kansas is also in this region. And so just kind of placing markers that connect to my personal history with these other representations of images from the time. Crystal, rightfully so, Rebecca's asking if we can wrap up, because we are, I mean, Lord, there's a whole damn show left. But anyhow, I think you're muted.
Oops. Maybe what we can do is, yeah, there's probably about 15 minutes at minimum of talking to go through in this space. But what we can say is that the work that you can see right now, the petition, there's other instances wherein Deanna and I have chatted, you know, on video. Deanna's artist talk, for example,
yeah,
for KWAG, as well as one of the interpretive videos for the exhibition that goes into the petition. So we won't speak too much about that right now. But if we can say quickly, there are a collection of objects in this space as well.
I'm good. I can make a
suggestion. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Acknowledging that on the one hand, we have people who have joined us until 1:30 and they may have to go and might have questions, but that we also hope that this lives online long term. How about we put some of those questions out there, and then we can keep talking a little bit longer.
To finish up the show?
Yeah, let's do that. I'm just going to flip through the slides a little bit while some of the questions come through.
So we have a question from Dimitra Christakos.
Hi.
Hi, Dimitra.
Asking for Deanna, do you have a chance to see Odessa Henley's show exhibitions that are evidence-based, both drawing upon and creating archives and providing visual access to such gripping and complex narratives? Your approach and her approach, which was originally presented as a form of curating but is now acknowledged as that of an artist have
Yeah.
the same incontrovertible impact on the exhibition visitors.
Thanks. That's like the best thing to say ever. I am a fan of Yudessa's work for reals, and I managed to catch the Punch and Judy show, and I thought that was the most extraordinary kind of compilation of materials, physical objects. I think the gold gun sticks out in my head. I'm like, what? I thought that was an extraordinary exhibition. I clearly don't have the budget that she has, but I deeply respect her practice. And then I think after I did the first artist talk about this exhibition, a colleague of mine at Concordia reached out and tipped me off to Abby Warburg. And I don't know if anybody else knows Abby Warburg, but he is a curator who created these extraordinary constellation of images that were like-minded. And it's the notion of the constellation of images and the connections between them is something that Warburg does as well. So yeah, thank you for that comment. I just think Yudessa's work is fantastic.
We also have a question about the traveling, whether this show is going to go anywhere, which we know that it is, and what that means in terms of how you would present this show elsewhere and invite, it says spreading the narrative about Kitchener. It's very deeply about Kitchener and very kind of tying local history to a broader understanding of the issues spoken about. So how would you approach that differently in a different environment, in a different kind of location?
Sure. I am doing that right now on a project that will be in Ottawa, and I am doing that for a project that is going to be in Montreal. And then I have another one that a one-off that's going to be in Toronto. And I just follow the threads. The show is not end. It's completely wide open. This show was preceded by two exhibitions that set this up already, right? So I produced a show, The God of Gods, a Canadian play at the Art Museum in 2019, and that research led into, I actually knew about Berlin before Kitchener Waterloo, and because of time had to figure out a way to make these all connect together. And so out of the Art Museum show, I took the documentation from that exhibition and used that as a template. The documentation has a template for a wallpaper project that looks just like the Art Museum, but the images have been swapped out to tell the extended research story between the connection between U of T and that narrative and Berlin in Germany and Empire and Vincent Massey. There's any number of ways that I can kind of draw this out. The Art Museum exhibition came out, was what I pulled out of that was the Group of Seven, performance of indigeneity, and a knowledge that I was trying to get to Kitchener, Ontario. And then the Berlin project picked up those threads of performance of indigeneity, of the tip of theosophy that's presented in the Art Museum show flows into Karl May and and his childhood books. The name completely escapes me right now. But
well, the fetishization of indigeneity too, right? May's project.
What is the name of the books? Oh, it's escaping me. But then Karl May is a fan of James Fenimore Cooper, which should, by example, if I were to go to the States, I'd probably pick up on the Fenimore Cooper Manifest Destiny American thing, and that would be another way out of that. And then so Berlin opened up the conversation of the Herero people and Namibia and that genocide alongside King Kaiser Wilhelm II's deep animosity for Britain and his public assaults on the British royalty, insisting that they had abandoned the white man's burden. And so that's what got me to Kitchener, Ontario, and picking up those threads. And so Ottawa will pick it up. Southern Ontario slave histories, the oral histories that are approached in the Black
Benjamin Drew's
Benjamin Drew's book will flow through the rest of Ontario, as will Empire, Queen Victoria, the founding of the National Gallery, and the royal elite in Ottawa, the first families, the family compact itself. And then that project will flow into the Francophone cultural elite that contributed to the making of the National Gallery, the National Railroad, et cetera, et cetera. The regional specificity of Kitchener Waterloo is not, it is what I unpacked here, but it is not the only thing that is unpacked here. And the show is clearly as dense as it is. Anything could be extended pretty much in any direction. I could be going into New York if I wanted to follow the Mohawk Nation, or any number of things, really, if that makes any sense. So if this show were to tour, when it does, I probably would add another chapter, or 5 or 6.
If I may say, the regional specificity of this project has not discouraged partners from taking this show. It hasn't created a kind of obstacle for other communities.
The relevance is definitely not.
Yeah, no, there's no, like, no one has said to me, like, I'm sorry, if it was a little bit more inclusive and more national in scope, then we would consider it. That's never come up.
So
So
I think it's interesting. You talked, Deanna, about, you drew a parallel between, or you talked about your art practice is actually kind of akin to a writing process. And your projects are all deeply, deeply researched, as we've definitely come, if we didn't know coming into this talk, we do now, in that sort of depth in archives and reference materials, but also breadth. And you're not the only artist I know that kind of stays up late scouring eBay looking for weird ephemera to kind of bring into things. What I find interesting is you talked about a few eureka moments over the course of this talk. And just what you're bringing it back to what you're talking about now, the idea that those eureka moments are sort of always there. It's what you're kind of tuned, what you happen to be tuned into, and where that takes you in your practice. So are there things that, I can imagine there were lots of things in the process of making these shows that you have to decide not to include as well. And that's an interesting process. Somebody's asked,
go ahead.
So somebody's actually asked a very practical question, which is, it's from Charlena Russell, can you suggest any sources to tracing back your family history that helped you in your search?
That's another talk, but the short of it is, when I started doing this research, I had nothing, but I did have, I went by the basic, which is I knew who my parents were and where they were born approximately. So I was using their basic genealogical information, and I traced as much as I knew. And then for the stuff that I didn't know, I started, for Black history, there's the Afro-Gen network, which is GenWeb. It's a genealogical website that's out there. There are a number of African-American genealogical sites on Facebook. The Smithsonian, if you're doing American work, has a number of resources on its website. The Library Archives in Ottawa also does. Most regional libraries, certainly the Kitchener-Waterloo, has some kind of genealogy thing connected to it. Certainly Toronto Archives, that kind of stuff. They have that material on the ready, and there usually is a user guide. I think, Charlene, where are your, I'm going to do this. Where are your family from?
Oh, well, Charlena is based in our community, actually.
Okay.
But she can speak to her roots.
The specifics of it. So toss that out there and I'll see what I can come up with. But in the meantime, if you don't mind, we'll take another question. And then, Detroit and all over the US. Okay. Ancestry.com works wonders. Every now and then they have them for free, but I know that there's a US specific Ancestry.com membership that's a little bit cheaper. I do a lot of research in newspapers for obituaries, but genealogy, Ancestry.com has a newspapers.com membership in it. So often, if there isn't census data, there'll be mentions of obituaries and other kind of data that's available there. I think it's under $100 for that membership. There's also, again, you can go to your civic library. So go to Detroit and find out what the civic archives are, the state archives. That's where I would also look at there. And that's where I would begin. So other than kind of getting into a one-on-one consultation, which I actually would do, that's where I would start. Sorry.
We have, no, that's amazing. I love when people actually are looking for like something, you know, an actual, something practical.
Yeah.
I think it's great. We have a question, another question from Beverly McNabb, which I think in my quick scan of it could also be an entire talk in itself. We recognize that the group of 7 climbed to prominence due to a white supremacist culture in Canada through the oppression and erasure of Black and Indigenous lives. How do we move forward in art institutions and the education system and society? There is a correlation of the G7 on a pedestal in Canada, like Sir John A. Do we dump them off the pedestal? Do we re-educate with context? Do we make amends by elevating artists from the oppressed, erased groups, give space for the voices of Black and Indigenous people of color? What other things do you see happening? Again, it's not even just a talk, an entire term in your.
I would say yes to everything. Yes to all of those things. Actually, do you want to use this as a segue to kind of flag the Eastman Gallery?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, and hi, Bev knows that space well, and she's been on a tour before. You know, I think when we were imagining how to acknowledge this relationship between the group and canon building and the connection between Lauren Harris and the wars, and also Barker Fairley, which we didn't get into here, but yeah, for sure. There are these, Barker Fairley was a champion of the group of 7, but is also name checked in a vile anti-Black, anti-Indigenous petition that appears in the exhibition. So, you know, KWAG is a collecting institution, and we have a number of works by folks in that canon. And, you know, it was the centenary anniversary of the first group of 7 exhibition. Our history dovetails with the group through familial connections. You know, one of our founding members was the aunt of A.Y. Jackson. So we wanted to acknowledge, you know, our own methods being implicated in the elevation of this canon, but we wanted to do it through like a really potent gesture. And I think that's where, like, in creating a conversation between, or not a conversation, but an interruption in the canon through Deanna's work became a really effective strategy. So in one room, I can't flip back to the slides right now, but in one room that we kind of zip through in images at the end, there's a salon style hang of paintings of Ontario landscapes, most of which are unoccupied. There is one where there's a clear human presence, and it's an image painting of Niagara Falls by Robert Whale. Would have been, we determined that was I can't remember if we determined that was a pre-abolition date, I think, on that painting, right? And then the interruption in that space is an image created by Deanna, which is a reproduction or a reproduction of several pages of an oral history by a formerly enslaved woman named Sophia Pooley. And she was purchased at Niagara by Joseph Brandt, her and her daughter, her sister, right? Lived with him. And Deanna, maybe you want to, I don't know if you want to speak to her history a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, she was stolen by the son-in-law of her first master, who brought her to Niagara, sold her to Brandt. Brandt brought her to Brantford amongst 40 other slaves who built his home and that ultimately that town. Sophia talks about being raised as his own for the most part. He tells stories of fishing with Molly and all this kind of stuff, and then talks about the hardship that she experienced with his Joseph Brandt's third wife, who had severely beaten her and was quite cruel to her. And Brandt had intervened after he had seen an axe wound on her forehead. And shortly after that, Brandt sold her to a white settler in Dundas named Hat. But what was compelling about that whole narrative was the fact that she talks about speaking the language, but there not being anybody left to speak it with. She talks about how she's 90 years old at the time of giving her oral history, and how she is, beholden to the community. She probably lived in the poorhouse for all we know, really, to be quite frank. But I think it's the pairing of that story that's very rich, and the Benjamin Drew publication itself is, easily a good 100 other oral histories of slaves in the Southern Ontario region, and clearly speaks to community that doesn't exist in these paintings. That's how I think you reckon with the fallacy of these landscapes. Add to it that Sophia Pooley's testimony is shared with another slave testimony of John Francis, who talks about witnessing how Black, their numbers, so to speak, are being taken advantage of and their land is being stolen from them. So when we ask the question of where these Black bodies go in this region, it's many underhanded ways, quite honestly. And this depiction, these romantic pictorials of landscape for the Queen and Empire, really, these are leisure landscapes, really kind of, they are not an accurate portrayal of landscape or the activities on it. It doesn't reflect in any way the gross violence and cruelty of this region. Sophia Pooley's testimony, John Francis's testimony, is not only in relationship with these images that these white settlers have constructed, but also it sits in relationship to an eagle song that was performed by my good friend Archer Pachalis, and it is played back in a parabolic speaker over top of, just shortly in front of the Sophia Pooley testimony. And really, you can't hear that song unless you are immediately in witness of Sophia's story. And so those two things in relationship to this room, that's how I think you start unpacking the canon, the fallacy of the Canadian story. More institutions need to do work like this, not like my work specifically, but this kind of deep analysis of their own complicitness in the ongoing perpetuation of the mythology. Deaccessioning wouldn't hurt my feelings. Using that money to fund the purchase of other works that interrogates Canadian history, which seems like a logical thing to do, not just me, but a whole bunch of other people. I think that there should be a lot more money allocated to other curatorial practices that are outside of perhaps city centers where people imagine that they're, that's the hubs. I think that in the future, where the real power is going to be is in other institutions outside of the city centers, that places where you can take risks. And I think that this is a perfect example of that kind of an adventure. I think there needs to be a willingness by art history programs to update their files and their curriculum. I think there's many, many things that should be happening, but certainly the list that you had detailed in the question are very good examples of it. And then along with what I have to offer, I think that those are really good starts. What would you say, Crystal?
Ditto. Actually, no, I do. And I'm implicated in all of that. And I'd like to think that through, a decade or so of working closely with artists and trying to figure out how to produce a kind of counter narrative from within the institution, that it does, those kind of efforts do require perseverance, but they can happen. They don't necessarily have to be out in the open too. They can happen surreptitiously and still be visible. Somebody can still be witness to that work in the archives. So, yeah.
I think
I think that's
We
where we're
might
going to
have-
end.
I think we're done.
Yeah.
But I would say, I would
think
echo what
awesome.
Crystal had to say, is that there are other recordings elsewhere on the KWAG website that'll fill in the gaps for the rest of the show. Come back, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think she might be frozen.
Thank you all so much. Did I go? I'll turn off my video. I'll turn off my video for this last bit. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mhm.
I'll have to do this faceless because my video seems to have decided that it's had enough. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you to KWAG for your assistance in supporting and developing and promoting this event. Thank you, KWAG, also for support by what you said, Deanna, about this idea of being of these regional spaces being able to take on some of this really meaty stuff is a very important space to kind of protect in the art ecology. Above all, thank you to Crystal and Deanna for doing the work that you do and for sharing it today with our audience. And an extra thanks to Crystal for so many good conversations over the years and for jumping on board when I called up with this little idea. Black Drones in the Hive will be touring somewhere sometime, so keep your eyes out for that information. And we also have more exhibition tours lined up that we're excited to share with you and information about these, so please sign up for our newsletter. And that's it from us for today. Thank you all so much and have a beautiful day.
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.